Picture this: March 1896. An African army, armed, organized, and commanded entirely by Africans, faces down a European colonial power at the height of imperial conquest. While the scramble for Africa devours the continent, one nation stands defiant. The Italian Royal Army, flush with confidence from decades of European military dominance, marches into the Ethiopian highlands expecting another easy colonial victory. They will be catastrophically wrong. This is the Battle of Adwa, the day an African empire shattered the myth of European invincibility and sent shockwaves through every colonial capital from London to Berlin. This is the battle that proved Africa couldn't be conquered. The Kingdom of Italy, unified only 35 years earlier in 1861, arrived late to the imperial feast. By the 1880s, Britain controlled Egypt, France dominated West Africa, and Belgium's King Leopold carved out his brutal Congo Free State. Italy, desperate for international prestige and colonial resources, turned its ambitions toward the Horn of Africa. The target, the Ethiopian Empire, one of the oldest Christian civilizations on Earth, tracing its imperial lineage back 3,000 years to the legendary Queen of Sheba. In 1889, Italian diplomats believed they had secured their prize through cunning rather than conquest. Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia signed the Treaty of Wuchale with the Italian government, an agreement that appeared to establish friendship and trade. But the devil lurked in translation. The Italian version of Article 17 declared that Ethiopia must conduct all foreign affairs through Italy, effectively making Ethiopia an Italian protectorate. The Amharic version stated that Ethiopia could use Italy as an intermediary if it chose to. When European powers began recognizing Italian claims over Ethiopia, Menelik understood the deception immediately. Emperor Menelik II was no puppet ruler. At 52 years old, he had spent decades consolidating power, modernizing his military, and navigating the treacherous waters of European diplomacy. He formally renounced the Treaty of Wuchale in 1893, declaring to European powers, "Ethiopia has need of no one. She stretches out her hands unto God." Italy responded with military pressure, occupying Eritrea to the north and pushing into Tigrayan territory. By early 1896, tensions exploded into open warfare. Italian Prime Minister Francesco Crispi, facing political pressure at home and believing in the racial superiority that infected European thinking, ordered his commander in Eritrea, General Oreste Baratieri, to advance into Ethiopia and crush Menelik's forces. Crispi's cable was unambiguous. Military action was necessary to restore Italian prestige. General Baratieri commanded approximately 17,700 men, including 10,596 Italian soldiers and 7,104 Eritrean Askari troops recruited locally. They possessed modern Carcano rifles, mountain artillery pieces, and the confidence of a European army that had never lost to an African force. What Baratieri didn't fully comprehend was the enemy he faced. Emperor Menelik had issued a call to arms across his empire, invoking both national defense and religious duty. From every corner of Ethiopia, from the Tigrayan highlands to the Shiwan heartland to the newly conquered southern territories, provincial armies marched toward the gathering point. Menelik assembled approximately 100,000 warriors, with estimates ranging from 80,000 to 120,000 depending on the source. Crucially, between 70,000 and 80,000 were armed with modern rifles, many purchased from European arms dealers, others captured from previous Italian defeats. The Ethiopian army possessed at least 42 artillery pieces. This wasn't a tribal militia. This was a modernizing imperial army defending its sovereignty. The strategic situation favored neither side completely. General Baratieri faced a logistical nightmare. His supply lines stretched over 400 kilometers from the Eritrean port of Massawa, crossing some of the most unforgiving terrain in Africa. Mountain passes, waterless valleys, and narrow tracks vulnerable to ambush. His forces occupied advanced positions around Adigrat and the fortified camp at Sauria, but they were operating in hostile territory, dependent on supplies that arrived irregularly. Disease, desertion, and the psychological weight of isolation plagued his troops. Politically, Baratieri walked a tightrope. Rome demanded a decisive victory to justify the colonial venture and silence critics who questioned the Italian East Africa campaign. Yet militarily, Baratieri understood his vulnerability. He preferred a defensive strategy, fortify positions, force Menelik to attack prepared Italian positions and bleed the Ethiopian army through superior firepower. A sensible plan, but politics overruled military prudence. Emperor Menelik faced his own pressures. His massive army couldn't remain mobilized indefinitely. The logistical burden of feeding 100,000 men and thousands of camp followers strained even Ethiopia's resources. The rainy season approached, and many provincial levies would need to return home for planting. Menelik needed battle soon, or his coalition would dissolve. Yet he was patient, maneuvering his forces closer to Italian positions, cutting supply routes, and waiting for Baratieri to make a mistake. The terrain around Adwa, a small town in the Tigrayan highlands, would prove decisive. The landscape consisted of rugged mountains, steep valleys, and plateaus rising to over 2,500 meters elevation. Three dominant peaks, Mount Rajo Ariana, Mount Bela, and Mount Semayata, formed a natural amphitheater. Whoever controlled the high ground controlled the battlefield. The Italians, accustomed to European warfare on relatively flat terrain, underestimated how Ethiopian forces could use this vertical battlefield. Menelik's tactical approach combined traditional Ethiopian warfare with modern military thinking. His army organized into provincial contingents, each commanded by a regional noble or RAS. These weren't disorganized bands. Each contingent maintained internal discipline and coordination. Menelik positioned his forces carefully. Ras Alula commanded the right wing with approximately 18,000 warriors. Ras Mikael led the left with another 18,000, and Menelik himself commanded the center with 25,000 troops. Empress Taidu Batul, Menelik's formidable wife, commanded the imperial guard and reserve forces, a detail that shocked European sensibilities, but reflected Ethiopian tradition where women occasionally led in battle. On February 29, 1896, Baratieri's situation reached crisis point. His officers divided. Some advocated immediate withdrawal to defensible positions, others demanded attack to restore honor. During a contentious war council, Baratieri's subordinates, particularly the aggressive Brigadier General Matteo Albertone, pushed for offensive action. Pride, political pressure, and misjudgment converged. Baratieri issued orders for a night march on March 1st, intending to occupy the heights above Adwa before dawn and surprise the Ethiopian army. The Italian plan required 3 brigade columns to advance separately through mountain passes in darkness, then converge on the high ground by morning. Coordination was critical. The maps were inaccurate. The terrain was treacherous, and the Ethiopian army wasn't where the Italians thought it was. Every ingredient for catastrophe was in place. The Italian columns moved out after midnight on March 1, 1896, under a moonless sky. Silence and stealth were paramount, but almost immediately everything went wrong. The maps Baratieri's staff relied upon were catastrophically inaccurate, based on incomplete surveys and faulty intelligence. Mountain peaks were misidentified, distances were wrong. Critical passes went unmarked. As the 3 brigades, Albertone's brigade on the right, Arimondi's in the center, Dabormida's on the left, and Elena's in reserve, stumbled through the darkness, they lost contact with each other. Brigadier General Albertone's brigade, advancing on what he believed was the correct route, pushed too far forward. By dawn, Albertone found himself separated from the main force by several kilometers, occupying an exposed position on the slopes near Mount Bela. He had no idea the main Ethiopian army was positioned directly ahead, nor did he realize his supporting brigades weren't where they should be. Albertone's approximately 3,000 men, Italian infantry and Eritrean askari, suddenly found themselves isolated on hostile ground as the sun rose over the Ethiopian highlands. The Ethiopian scouts reported the Italian movement immediately. Menelik had spent weeks gathering intelligence on Italian positions, and his scouts tracked every column. As dawn broke around 5:30 a.m., the Ethiopian war drums began pounding across the mountains, a deep rhythmic thunder that echoed through valleys and announced the coming storm. Menelik gave the order, attack. What happened next shattered every European assumption about African warfare. Ras Alula's right wing, approximately 18,000 strong, descended on Albertone's exposed brigade like an avalanche. But this wasn't a disorganized charge. Ethiopian commanders used the terrain brilliantly, sending skirmishers forward to engage Italian positions while main forces maneuvered to envelop flanks. Ethiopian riflemen, many armed with modern Remington, Martini Henry, and Winchester rifles, provided covering fire while warriors moved through dead ground invisible to Italian observers. Albertone's men fought desperately. Italian artillery crews fired into the advancing masses, cutting bloody lanes through Ethiopian ranks. The Carcano rifles barked in disciplined volleys. But the mathematics were brutal. 3,000 men facing 18,000 isolated, with ammunition supplies that couldn't be replenished. Ethiopian warriors surged forward in successive waves, absorbing casualties that would have broken European morale, but pressing forward with terrifying determination. By 8 a.m., Albertone's brigade was surrounded, overwhelmed, and shattered. Albertone himself was captured. The entire brigade effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. General Aramondi's brigade in the center heard the catastrophic sounds of Albertone's destruction, but couldn't reach him in time. Aramondi occupied positions on Mount Rajo Ariana, attempting to form a defensive line. Menelik personally directed the Ethiopian center, approximately 25,000 warriors, against Aramondi's approximately 4,000 men. The Ethiopian assault was methodical and relentless. Rifle fire crackled continuously. Ethiopian artillery, operated by Russian and French advisors and trained Ethiopian crews, bombarded Italian positions with surprising accuracy. Aramondi's men held for nearly 2 hours, creating temporary breastworks from stones and fighting with the discipline expected of European regulars. But Ethiopian forces found the flanks, infiltrated through ravines, and climbed slopes the Italians had deemed impassable. The defensive perimeter contracted steadily. Ammunition dwindled. The wounded had nowhere to evacuate. Around 10 a.m., Ethiopian warriors breached the Italian lines. The fighting became hand-to-hand, savage, desperate, and unforgiving. General Aramondi died leading a counterattack, cut down by rifle fire. His brigade broke, survivors fleeing downslope in chaotic retreat. On the Italian left, Brigadier General Dabormida's brigade wandered through the mountains, geographically lost and tactically irrelevant. Dabormida, following his faulty maps, had marched his 3,000 men into a valley several kilometers from the main battle. When he finally heard the sounds of combat, he attempted to march toward the fighting. Instead, he led his column directly into Ras Mikhail's left wing, 18,000 fresh Ethiopian warriors who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Dabormida's brigade found itself trapped in a narrow valley with steep slopes on both sides. Ethiopian forces occupied the high ground completely, turning the valley into a killing zone. Rifle fire poured down from multiple angles. Ethiopian cavalry blocked the valley exits. Artillery shells exploded among the packed Italian ranks. For 3 hours, Dabormida's men endured hell. They attempted to break out repeatedly, each charge melting under withering fire. By early afternoon, Dabormida's entire command was annihilated. Dabormida himself died fighting, his body found later surrounded by his fallen officers. Not a single organized unit from his brigade escaped. General Baratieri, positioned with Elena's reserve brigade several kilometers to the rear, watched his army disintegrate. He ordered Elena forward to cover the retreat, but any thought of offensive action was gone. The Italian colonial adventure was collapsing in real time. By noon, 3 of his 4 brigades were destroyed or routed. The battlefield was chaos. Fleeing Italian soldiers, pursuing Ethiopian warriors, abandoned artillery pieces, discarded rifles, and the wounded left behind in the desperate flight. The retreat became a rout. Italian and Eritrean survivors fled northward toward the Eritrean border, a journey of over 100 kilometers through hostile territory. Ethiopian cavalry and infantry pursued relentlessly for days, cutting down stragglers and capturing supply columns. Some Italian units maintained cohesion and conducted fighting withdrawals, but many simply dissolved. The logistical lifeline that had barely sustained the Italian advance became a trail of abandoned equipment and exhausted men. The Battle of Adwa lasted approximately 6 hours of intense combat, but its consequences would echo for decades. The casualty figures were staggering and unambiguous. The Italian Royal Army suffered approximately 6,500 dead, nearly 60% of their Italian troops killed. Another 1,500 were wounded, and approximately 3,000 were captured, including 1,800 Italians. Entire battalions ceased to exist. It was the worst defeat a European colonial power had suffered in Africa up to that point. Worse than the British disaster at Isandlwana in 1879. More complete than any French colonial setback. Ethiopian casualties were significant but sustainable, estimated between 4,000 and 7,000 killed and approximately 10,000 wounded. For an army of 100,000, these losses, while painful, didn't threaten operational capability. More importantly, Ethiopia retained control of the battlefield, its sovereignty, and its independence. The immediate political consequences in Italy were explosive. News of the Adwa disaster reached Rome on March 2nd, transmitted via telegraph from Eritrea. The Italian public, fed years of propaganda about easy colonial victories and African inferiority, was stunned. Prime Minister Francesco Crispi, the architect of the aggressive policy, resigned in disgrace on March 9, 1896. His political career ended in the Ethiopian highlands. Italy sued for peace. The Treaty of Addis Ababa, signed on October 26, 1896, represented a humiliating reversal. Italy formally recognized Ethiopian sovereignty and independence, renounced all claims under the fraudulent Treaty of Wuchale, and paid war indemnities. Italy retained only the coastal colony of Eritrea, and even that presence was permanently diminished. Italian colonial ambitions in East Africa were crushed. They wouldn't return to Ethiopia for 40 years, until Mussolini's fascist regime invaded with tanks, aircraft, and poison gas in 1935. For Ethiopia and Africa, Adwa represented something unprecedented in the colonial era. Proof that African nations could defeat European powers on the battlefield through organization, leadership, and courage. Emperor Menelik II became an international figure, respected even by the colonial powers that had sought to subjugate his nation. Ethiopia remained independent throughout the scramble for Africa, the only African nation aside from Liberia to avoid colonization during the imperial zenith. The Battle of Adwa resonated far beyond Ethiopia's borders. Across Africa, colonized peoples saw that European military superiority wasn't absolute. Resistance movements drew inspiration from Menelik's victory. In the African diaspora, particularly in the Americas and the Caribbean, Adwa became a symbol of Black pride and capability during an era of vicious scientific racism and Jim Crow segregation. Pan-Africanist thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey cited Adwa as evidence against claims of African inferiority. Historians recognize Adwa as a turning point in the narrative of colonialism. The British military historian Raymond Jonas noted that Adwa was the first decisive victory by an African army over a European army in modern times. It demonstrated that African political systems could modernize, adopt new military technologies, and compete successfully against European powers when led effectively and defending their homeland. Emperor Menelik II ruled until his death in 1913, remembered as the leader who preserved Ethiopian independence during Africa's darkest hour. Every year on March 2nd, Ethiopia celebrates Adwa Victory Day as a national holiday, commemorating the battle that proved the impossible was achievable, that Africa couldn't simply be conquered, and that Ethiopian sovereignty would endure. The historical record of the Battle of Adwa draws from multiple authoritative sources. According to Raymond Jonas's comprehensive study, The Battle of Adwa, African Victory in the Age of Empire, published by Harvard University Press, the battle represented a sophisticated military achievement that combined traditional Ethiopian martial culture with modern military organization and technology. Jonas's work draws extensively from Italian military archives, Ethiopian chronicles, and contemporary diplomatic correspondence to reconstruct the battle's tactical progression. The Italian General Staff's official history, L'Africa Orientale nel conflitto mondiale, provides detailed casualty figures and unit-level accounts from surviving Italian officers, offering sobering acknowledgement of the disaster's magnitude. Harold Marcus's scholarly work, The Life and Times of Menelik II, Ethiopia, 1844-1913, contextualizes the battle within Menelik's broader reign and his strategic vision for Ethiopian modernization and sovereignty. Ethiopian oral traditions and written chronicles, including the Royal Chronicles of Emperor Menelik II, preserved in Addis Ababa, provide the African perspective often absent from colonial-era military histories. These sources reveal the Ethiopian strategic planning, the mobilization of provincial armies, and the perspective of defenders fighting for their homeland rather than colonial expansion. The military lessons of Adwa remained relevant throughout the 20th century. Studied in military academies as an example of how defenders with knowledge of local terrain, motivated by national survival, and led by competent commanders, could defeat numerically smaller but technologically equivalent forces through superior strategy and determination. If you found this account of history's most significant anti-colonial military victory fascinating, the story of African resistance to European imperialism extends far beyond Adwa. From the Zulu Wars in southern Africa to the Mahdi Uprising in Sudan, African peoples contested colonization at every turn, often with remarkable military innovation. The narrative that Africa was passively conquered is as false as the assumption that led General Baratieri into the Ethiopian highlands in March 1896. The Battle of Adwa stands as permanent testament that courage, organization, and legitimate defense of sovereignty can overcome even the most confident imperial ambitions. In the mountains near a small Ethiopian town, an African emperor and his people changed history and proved that some nations simply cannot be conquered.